His polite smile was a knife's edge. "Are you sure you can follow this presentation?" he asked, loud enough for the Navy representatives to hear. "They don't like mistakes." Every eye at the table turned to me. They didn't know the design he was about to present as his own was actually mine. I took a slow sip of water. In less than an hour, the show would begin, and he would be the star in a way he never expected. My name is Cassidy Vale. I am 31 years old, the Director of Product Development at Halcyon Dynamics, and at this moment, I am a prisoner of fine dining. I sat wedged between my husband, Noah, and his father, Randall Pike, the strategic titan of the company and the patriarch of our lives. We were at Blakeford's, Riverton's Temple of Dark Wood. Discreet service and overpriced steaks. The long, linen-draped table was an exercise in corporate diplomacy, a carefully arranged seating chart designed to charm the delegation from the United States Navy. On the line was the Sovereign Project, a naval defense system that represented the next decade of the company's revenue and, for me, the last 18 months of my life. Randall was holding court, as he always did. He had the kind of effortless, booming confidence that powerful men mistake for charisma. His voice, aged like expensive whiskey, filled the small gaps in the conversation. He was telling a story about his childhood, a sepia-toned anecdote of watching destroyers glide out of the harbor. It was a story we'd all heard before, but tonight it was weaponized. "You see, Admiral," he said, leaning toward a stoic, silver-haired man named Hayes, "it's not just about the hull displacement or the thrust-to-weight ratio. It's about the resonance. The entire superstructure has a harmonic frequency. Back then, we could feel it in the cobblestones." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the Navy contingent before landing, deliberately, on me. "You can model all the telemetry you want, but if you haven't felt that vibration, you don't truly understand the machine. It's a gut thing." He peppered his narrative with just enough technical jargon, terms like azimuthal projection and signal degradation under thermal layering, to sound authoritative. Each term was a small dart aimed in my direction, a subtle test designed to suggest that my expertise was purely academic, sterile, and inferior to his homespun wisdom. It was a performance I knew well, a public undermining disguised as a charming reminiscence. The message was clear. I was the book-smart girl in a world of gut instinct men. Beneath the table, Noah's hand found mine. It wasn't a gesture of solidarity. It was a gentle, insistent squeeze, a familiar pressure that meant, "Don't let it go. Just smile." It was the same silent command I'd received 100 times at Pike family dinners, the unspoken rule that my ambition was something to be managed, contained, and certainly never displayed in a way that might cast a shadow on the family name. Noah loved me. I believed that. But he was a product of this system, a career diplomat in the Cold War between my career and his father's ego. His loyalty was perpetually, agonizingly, divided. I didn't squeeze back. My hand lay limp in his, my focus on keeping my breathing even, my posture perfect. I had learned to shrink on command, to fold my intelligence into a more palatable shape for their comfort. Captain Eva Rostova, a sharp woman seated to the Admiral's right, cut through the nostalgia with practiced efficiency. "It's an impressive piece of engineering, Randall. Your team has pushed the boundaries on the response automation. The simulation tomorrow is the linchpin for us. We need to see the fail-safes under maximum stress. Who will be leading that portion of the presentation?" The air seemed to thin. Every ambient sound in the restaurant, the clink of silverware, the murmur of other diners, faded into a dull hum. This was the moment, the question I had been waiting for, the one I knew would come. Randall took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. He placed the glass down with a soft click that sounded like a gavel. He smiled, a practiced, benevolent expression that never reached his eyes. "That would be me, Captain," he said smoothly, without a flicker of hesitation. "I've been steering this project personally. It's crucial to have a steady hand on the tiller for something this vital." The lie was so clean, So effortless. It was almost admirable. He hadn't written a single line of code. He hadn't designed a single component of the architecture. He had attended 4 high-level review meetings, offering vague, strategic guidance while my team and I worked 100-hour weeks, wrestling with the intricate logic that made Sovereign more than just an idea on a whiteboard. He had taken our work, my work, and draped his name over it like a flag. I felt a cold, clean anger settle in my gut. It wasn't the hot, messy rage of betrayal, but something more refined. It was the dispassionate focus of a sniper acquiring a target. I turned my head slightly, my gaze drifting past the table to the large, muted television mounted over the polished bar. A financial news network was running a story, the chyron at the bottom of the screen scrolling with stock tickers and headlines. I saw the words, Kensington Shipbuilding and Destroyer Maintenance Contract. It was a reminder of the world outside this room, of the larger game of contracts and consequences, a world where credit and accountability were everything. This dinner was merely a prelude. The main event was tomorrow. My phone, resting in my lap, gave a single, silent vibration. I glanced down under the cover of the tablecloth. The screen showed a message from Ben, my lead systems architect. Build locked, logs flagged. That was it. The final piece was in place. The presentation build Randall would use tomorrow was a perfect, functioning copy of the Sovereign simulation, but it was also a Trojan horse. Every file he had copied from my team's secure server, every document he had rebranded, had left a digital trail, a trail Ben had now isolated, hashed, and time-stamped. The trap was set. All Randall had to do was walk into it. A very thin, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. I looked up, meeting the gaze of Captain Rostova, who was watching me with a neutral, assessing expression. The tension Randall had created still lingered at the table. I felt it was my turn to speak, to perform the role of the supportive daughter-in-law. The wine selection here is remarkable, I said, my voice even and pleasant. They have a Cabernet from a small vineyard in Napa that pairs perfectly with the filet. The banality of the comment acted like a pressure release valve. The conversation shifted, the men talking about vineyards and travel, the brief moment of professional inquiry dissolving back into social pleasantry. Randall gave me a small, approving nod, pleased that I had played my part, that I had deflected the spotlight he so desperately craved. He believed he had won. He believed I had folded, as always. He let the conversation drift for a few more minutes before raising his glass, the crystal catching the low light. A toast, he announced, his voice resonating with theatrical gravity, to a long and fruitful partnership with the United States Navy, and to the men who keep the ship heading straight, in even the stormiest seas. He looked directly at Admiral Hayes, but the toast was for himself, the men. The word was a deliberate exclusion, a final, casual dismissal. Glasses clinked around the table. Noah raised his eyes avoiding mine. The other executives from Halcyon, men who knew exactly how much work I had done, smiled and drank. They were complicit, their silence bought with bonuses and job security. I raised my own glass. I didn't drink. Instead, I made a slow, deliberate scan of the table, etching each face into my memory. Admiral Hayes, a man of integrity, unknowingly participating in a charade. Captain Rostova, her intelligent eyes missing nothing, a potential ally. The junior officers, earnest and focused, the halcyon sycophants, their smiles broad and empty. My husband, his expression clouded with a familiar, helpless conflict, and finally, Randall Pike, basking in the glow of stolen credit, confident and utterly oblivious. I recorded the moment, the sound of their laughter, the sight of their raised glasses. I wanted to remember them exactly as they were in this instant, because I knew, with absolute certainty, how profound their silence would be tomorrow. The car ride home was a cocoon of expensive, suffocating silence. Noah kept his hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. The oppressive quiet was a language I had become fluent in during my 5 years as a pike. It was the sound of disagreement being deferred, of conflict being buried under a layer of civility. This particular silence was heavy with the weight of Randall's lie and Noah's refusal to acknowledge it. I didn't push. The argument that needed to happen tonight was a pointless skirmish. The war would be won tomorrow. Instead, I let my head rest against the cool glass of the window, the passing city lights blurring into streaks as my mind drifted back to the beginning, to my induction into the Pike family and its most sacred, unspoken law. Noah brought me to his parents' house for the first time on a crisp autumn afternoon. It wasn't a home so much as a monument to Randall Pike's success. It stood on a hill overlooking Riverton, a sprawling colonial with imposing white pillars that felt more like a courthouse than a residence. Inside, the walls were a gallery of his life. There was Randall shaking hands with a governor, Randall christening a ship, Randall standing at the center of every family photograph, his wife and son positioned around him like carefully placed satellites. He was the sun, and everyone else was caught in his orbit. I saw it immediately. This was a family that did not revolve, but orbited. Eleanor Pike, my future mother-in-law, greeted me with a kiss on each cheek that was as dry and rustling as old paper. She was an elegant woman, sculpted by years of holding the precise, rigid posture required of the wife of a great man. As she gave me the tour, she paused in the grand hallway, her manicured hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Her touch was feather-light, but her words were anchors. "A little piece of advice, dear," she said, her voice a low, pleasant murmur. "In this family, we protect its reputation, and that means we don't embarrass Randall. He carries a great deal of responsibility, and he needs our unwavering support." It wasn't a suggestion. It was the statement of a non-negotiable term in a contract I hadn't yet signed. The first and most important law. The patriarch must never lose face. Every Sunday dinner that followed was a masterclass in this law. The meals were less about nourishment and more about instruction. I learned to navigate conversations like a minesweeper. I was taught, through a series of gentle corrections and pointed questions, how to speak. I learned to offer opinions that were merely polished versions of Randall's own. I learned to tell anecdotes about my work that were interesting, but not too impressive, to display my intelligence as a charming accessory rather than a formidable tool. The goal was to be a credit to the family, but never to challenge its hierarchy. I had to be smart enough for Noah to have been right in choosing me, but not so smart that I might make his father feel threatened. I learned to answer every question with just enough information, and never, ever more. But at Halcyon Dynamics, I refused to orbit. Work was the one place I could build my own solar system. I was good at my job, and I had built a fiercely loyal team around me. A small, brilliant constellation of talent. There were 6 of them. Ben, my Stoic systems architect, who could make code sing. Maya, our cybersecurity specialist, who thought like a predator. And 4 other engineers who were the best in their fields. We were a unit, insulated by the complexity of our work. We were the engine deep in the hull of the ship, unseen but essential. Randall's role at the company had transitioned from active leadership to something more ceremonial. He was a strategic advisor, a living legend whose primary function was to leverage his network, to open doors with a phone call and a round of golf. He was the rainmaker, the face of the company. He no longer dirtied his hands with the messy, beautiful work of creation. He didn't write code. He didn't run diagnostics. He didn't understand the intricate neural pathways of the systems we built. He was a man who sold maps of countries he had never visited. When the Department of Defense greenlit the Sovereign Project, I knew it would be the most complex and politically charged undertaking of my career. I also knew that Randall's shadow would loom large over it. To protect the project's integrity from ego and interference, I made a critical decision. I created a ghost team within my own division. I called us Rook. The name was a private joke. A chess piece that moves in straight, powerful lines, often used to protect the king, but also to trap him. Officially, we didn't exist. We were a black box. a designated internal review group tasked with stress testing every component of Sovereign from an anonymous, adversarial perspective. All of our core documentation, every architectural diagram, every line of mission-critical code, was authored and signed by Rook. It was a collective, digital signature, a shield of anonymity. It allowed the work to be judged on its merit alone, free from the politics of personality. I wrote most of those documents myself, late at night when the office was empty, my fingers flying across the keyboard, building my fortress line by line. My team knew. They understood the necessity of it. The work was ours, and its signature was our pact. The first time I saw the presentation, the one Randall was scheduled to give to the Navy, was 3 weeks ago. It was on a shared executive server, in a folder innocently labeled Sovereign Navy Draft. I opened it out of professional curiosity. Slide after slide was filled with my diagrams, my data, my words. The Rook watermark had been scrubbed from every corner, and there, on the title slide, in bold, 48-point font, were the words, Project Lead, Randall T. Pike. In that moment, seeing his name plastered over my soul, I felt no shock. There was only a profound, clarifying cold. This was the Pike Law of Silence in its purest corporate form. My name was an inconvenience. His name, the name of a legend, was an asset. For the convenience of the narrative, for the comfort of the stakeholders. My contribution was to be erased. My silence was expected. It was my duty, as a good employee, as a good daughter-in-law, to allow the lie to stand. It was easier for everyone if Randall was the hero of the story. I closed the file. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I thought of Eleanor's soft-spoken warning in the hallway of that grand, suffocating house. We don't embarrass Randall. I understood. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the law applied to me. They thought they had taught me to be silent. And they were right. I had learned that silence, when deployed strategically, is a weapon. To challenge him then would have been foolish. It would have been a messy internal affair. A she said, he said, the ambitious young woman against the beloved company founder, the daughter-in-law trying to usurp the patriarch. I would have been painted as hysterical, ungrateful. I would have lost. So I didn't break their law, not right away. Instead, I chose to bide my time. I let him take the files. I watched as he rehearsed his speech. I let him walk deeper and deeper into the trap. Believing the silence from my end was acquiescence, I decided I would not be the one to expose him. I would create the perfect stage, the perfect audience, and the perfect script. I would let the lawbreaker expose himself. And that day is now just a few hours away. It arrives with the morning sun. It will happen in Conference Room Aurora, under the watchful eyes of the United States Navy. The one audience that values truth and accountability above all else. They came to see a presentation. They are about to witness a dissection. Vengeance is not an act of passion. It is a project, and like any complex project, it requires meticulous planning, rigorous data collection, and a deep understanding of the system you intend to disrupt. My system was Randall Pike, and his operating code was a lifetime of unchecked arrogance. My work began not in the present, but in the past, buried deep within Halcyon's digital archives. I needed to establish a pattern of behavior. I was looking for a crack in the gleaming white wall of his reputation. I found it in an internal audit report from 7 years ago. The document was a desert of corporate jargon, dry and forgettable, which is why no one ever thought to purge it. It detailed the fallout from a deal Randall had closed with an aerospace firm. In his eagerness to secure the contract, he had promised them a proprietary guidance algorithm that, at the time, existed only as a theoretical concept in one of our research papers. He had sold a ghost. The report detailed the frantic, multi-million-dollar scramble to build the promised feature post-contract, the exhausted engineers, the near miss on the delivery deadline. Randall received a formal, confidential reprimand from the board. He had risked the company's integrity for the sake of his own glory. It was the precedent I needed. He had a history of overstating his involvement and claiming ownership of work that wasn't his. This wasn't a one-time mistake, it was a methodology. With that knowledge, I turned my attention to the present. His theft of the Sovereign project was bolder, but the underlying psychology was the same. He couldn't have done the work himself, so he simply decreed that it was his. I began a systematic search of the executive-level servers. I wasn't looking for anything obvious. I was looking for the kind of folder a man like Randall would create, something that sounded important, something that fed his ego. I searched for keywords like oversight, direction, and strategy, and then I found it, a folder, nestled within his private directory, with a name that was both innocent and deeply arrogant. Legacy. My breath caught. It was the perfect name. He saw this act of plagiarism not as a theft, but as the absorption of my work into his enduring legacy. Inside was a treasure trove. It contained every core document from the Rook Secure Directory, but it also held something more valuable: his tracks. There was a draft of a memo to his executive assistant, outlining a communications strategy for the project. It detailed how he was to be positioned as the visionary, while the technical team, referred to simply as the engineers, were the implementers. There were email chains where he had forwarded Rook's detailed weekly progress reports to the CEO, with a simple cover note: "My team is making excellent progress. We are on schedule. My team." The true evidence, however, the kind that was cold, hard, and irrefutable, was not in the words, but in the metadata. Every file in a modern computer system has a hidden history, a set of digital fingerprints. I opened the properties for the master presentation file, the one he had been rehearsing. The digital trail was laughably clear. The original file, Sovereign Master Arch, had been created by my account, C. Vale, on the Rook server. The file in his legacy folder was a perfect copy, but its metadata told a new story. Owner, R. Pike. Last modified, Lowe, his assistant, and most damningly, the system logs showed the exact timestamp of the copy action, originating from his assistant's specific internal IP address, pulling the data directly from our secure folder, to which Randall had granted himself unauthorized administrative access. He hadn't even bothered to cover his tracks. The arrogance was astounding. He believed himself so untouchable that the rules of evidence and accountability simply did not apply to him. He lived in a world where his will became reality, and the details were for lesser people to manage. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I suppressed it. A premature accusation would collapse the entire structure I was building. If I reported it to HR, it would become an internal investigation. It would be handled quietly. Randall would get another confidential reprimand. His assistant would be fired, and I would be labeled a troublemaker. The lie would remain intact in the minds of the Navy and the public. My objective wasn't a slap on his wrist in a closed room. It was a public correction of the record in the most important room. So, I did nothing. I didn't delete the folder. I didn't report it. I simply took a secure, encrypted copy of everything and flagged the original's location. My next step was to engage the system itself. I scheduled a meeting with Julian Croft, Halcyon's general counsel. Julian was a sharp, pragmatic man in his late 50s, whose loyalty was to the company's legal integrity, not to any single executive. I framed the meeting as a proactive query. I didn't mention Randall's name. "Julian," I began, sitting across from him in his sterile, book-lined office. "I'm doing a process review for the Sovereign project, given the sensitivity of the IP. I want to ensure our protocols for authorship attribution are ironclad. Could you walk me through the legal standing of digital metadata as proof of origin in a potential dispute?" He listened patiently, his fingers steepled. I laid out a hypothetical scenario, describing a situation where a project's source materials were rebranded at an executive level without the consent or credit of the originating team. I watched his eyes narrow as I described the nature of the metadata trail. He was connecting the dots. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Cassidy, This isn't a hypothetical, is it? Are you planning a lawsuit? This was the critical juncture. The moment my intent had to be made clear, I met his gaze and didn't blink. "No, Julian," I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I'm not planning a lawsuit. I'm planning a presentation, and I need this evidence to be unimpeachable by tomorrow morning." A flicker of understanding, and perhaps a glint of admiration, passed through his eyes. He grasped the strategy immediately. This wasn't about financial compensation. It was about the public establishment of fact. "I see," he said slowly. He picked up his phone. "I'll have our head of compliance meet us in the digital forensics lab in 10 minutes. We will create a full cryptographic hash of the original Rook files and the contents of this legacy folder. Everything will be time-stamped, sealed, and legally notarized. By morning, you will have a chain of custody that would be admissible in the Supreme Court." While compliance did their work, I completed my own. I went back to my lab. To the master build of the Sovereign simulation software, I added a single, elegant piece of code, a dozen lines in a multi-million-line program. It was a conditional trigger, an if-then statement tied to the login credentials used to launch the presentation mode. If the user account was on the approved list of the Rook development team, the simulation would run normally. But if the simulation was launched by any other user, a user like Randall Pike, who had administrative access but no development credentials, a single, discrete line of text would appear in the bottom left corner of the main display. It wasn't a flashy warning or an error message. It was a simple factual attribution, displayed in a calm, 12-point system font. Source material origin, Project Rook, asset owner, Cassidy Vale. It was a watermark of truth, woven into the very fabric of the work itself. Now, hours before the dawn, the final pieces are in place. The notarized digital evidence is in a sealed envelope on Julian's desk, a copy on a secure drive in my briefcase. The software trap is set. The entire intricate mechanism is built. All it needs is a key to turn it, and that key, the final administrator password that will launch the simulation, rests only with me, its activation sequence committed to memory, in my hand. My phone feels cool and inert. In my mind, the activation key is a weightless thing, as calm and composed as a pen poised over a blank sheet of paper, waiting to write the final sentence. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. While the city slept and Noah lay in our bed, alone, I was in my sanctuary, the systems lab at Halcyon. The only sounds were the whisper of the ventilation and the low, harmonic hum of the server racks, a choir of processing power that was, to me, the most comforting music in the world. This was not just an office, it was my armory, my command center. The meeting tomorrow was the battleground, and I was preparing for war. It was 2 a.m. For the past 4 hours, I had been running the Sovereign simulation through its final gauntlet of stress tests. This had to be flawless. Randall's lie could not be allowed the shelter of a technical glitch. I cycled the full simulation on 3 separate hardware configurations, one matching the Navy's standard shipboard servers, one on our own proprietary system, and one on a stripped-down, legacy setup to test its resilience. On 3 glowing monitors, intricate webs of data bloomed and shifted as I pushed the system to its absolute limits. I simulated a cascading sensor failure, a full-scale cyber attack on its primary communication node, and a catastrophic power loss. Sovereign's logic held, its fail-safes engaged, its redundant systems rerouted data, and its core functionality remained stable. It performed exactly as I had designed it to. My work was perfect. Perfection, however, is a matter of layers. I moved from the macro to the micro, running a full diagnostic on the presentation build itself. I checked the security of the handshake protocols, the efficiency of the memory caching, and the integrity of the multi-factor authentication system. Every digital door was locked, every pathway secure. My watermark of truth was embedded deep within the code, invisible and dormant, waiting for the wrong key to turn in the lock. There would be no bugs, no crashes, no excuses. The performance of the software would be beyond reproach, ensuring that the only failure in the room tomorrow would be a human one. Next, the physical artifacts. I walked over to the high-speed printer and collected a stack of freshly printed documents. They were simplified user guides, something I had designed specifically for the Navy delegation. They used clear, concise language and clean graphics to explain the simulation's phases, stripping away the dense technical jargon. It was a gesture of respect for the client, a tool to facilitate their understanding. Randall would arrive with charisma and grand pronouncements. I would arrive with meticulously prepared, useful work. My professionalism would be my shield and my sword. I fed the pages into the binder, the clean, mechanical punch of the holes, a satisfying rhythm in the quiet lab. At 1 a.m., I had a brief, encrypted video call with Ben. He was at home, but his mind was in the Aurora conference room. "The camera is in place," he reported, his voice low. "It's one of the new ceiling-mounted sprinkler heads. The resolution is 4K. It has a perfect, unobstructed view of the presentation console, keyboard, and the main screen. It will record a time-stamped, high-definition log of the entire login sequence." It was another layer of irrefutable fact. There would be video evidence of whose hands were on the keyboard when the lie was made manifest on the screen. "I'll be monitoring the feed remotely," he added. "You won't be alone." After the call, I turned to my own briefcase. I opened a small, velvet-lined box and took out a pen. It was sleek and black, a high-end fountain pen that looked perfectly at home in a corporate boardroom. It was also a high-fidelity digital audio recorder, perfectly legal for the purpose of recording minutes in a formal, declared business meeting, which this was. I made a mental note to announce that the meeting would be recorded for archival purposes. The pen was my witness. Finally, the most critical piece of physical evidence. I took a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind reserved for the board of directors. Inside, I placed a thumb drive containing the complete, notarized copy of the evidence from the legacy folder. With it, I included a one-page, formally written letter to Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the board. The letter was a request for an immediate and full audit of the intellectual property attribution for the Sovereign Project, citing a potential violation of the company's code of conduct. I sealed the envelope. It was my insurance policy, a fail-safe. If for any reason my primary plan failed, this letter would ensure the truth would still come out, albeit through a slower, more bureaucratic process. It was the ace I prayed I wouldn't have to play. When I finally walked through the door of our apartment, it was nearly 4 a.m. The lights were dim, but Noah was awake, sitting in an armchair in the living room, a silhouette against the city lights. The tension in the room was a physical presence. He watched me as I dropped my briefcase by the door and shrugged off my jacket. "Cass," he said, his voice rough with lack of sleep. "It's almost dawn. Why are you doing this to yourself? It's just a presentation." I stopped, my back to him. Just a presentation. The words were a measure of the vast, unbridgeable canyon that had opened between us. I turned slowly to face him. I was too tired, too focused, for artifice. "Because this is my job. Noah," I said, my voice flat. "It's the most important project of my career. It has to be perfect." He stood up and walked towards me, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "I know that, but you're wound so tight you might snap. Dad is leading the presentation. He's got it under control. He knows how to handle these things." He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture of exasperation I knew well. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He couldn't. He just wants what's best for the project. There it was, the family mantra, the justification for every overreach, every act of ego, every silent theft. Randall's intentions were always noble. His actions were always for the greater good. It was the story they told themselves, the foundation of the law of silence, and for the first time, I refused to let it stand. "Or what's best for his name," I said. My voice was quiet, but the words cut through the dim light of the apartment like shards of glass. He flinched, The accusation hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. He had no defense against it because he knew it was the truth. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I saw the conflict in his eyes, the painful tearing of a man caught between the woman he loved and the father he was conditioned to revere. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. There was nothing to say. He turned and walked back to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room with the coming dawn. The silence he left behind was no longer about deferral. It was about defeat. An hour later, showered and dressed in a dark gray suit that was my professional armor, I stood before the bathroom mirror. The person looking back at me was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and bright with a cold, hard fire. I ignored the faint tremors of adrenaline in my hands. I had accounted for every technical variable, every piece of evidence. Now, I had to account for myself. The moment would come when I would have to interrupt, to take control of the room. My words had to be precise, unshakable, and free of emotion. I leaned closer to the mirror, meeting my own gaze. "Excuse me, Randall," I practiced, my voice a low whisper. "There seems to be a slight discrepancy in the asset attribution on this slide. Perhaps you could clarify." "No, too soft, too polite." I took a breath. "Randall, I'm going to have to stop you there. That statement is inaccurate." "Better, but too confrontational. I needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I needed a phrase that was both professional and utterly devastating. A question that was not a question." I stood up straight, my posture mirroring the confidence I needed to project. I looked my reflection dead in the eye. "Captain Rostova," I said, my voice perfectly level, calm, and clear. "For the sake of accuracy in the official record, could you ask Mr. Pike to identify the lead architect of the Rook Protocol he is currently displaying?" I said it again and again, until the words were not just memorized, but a part of me, until they were as clean and sharp and ready as every other weapon I had prepared for the day ahead. The Aurora conference room was a glass cage suspended 20 floors above the city. Sunlight, clean and cold, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the polished chrome and the precisely arranged glasses of water on the long mahogany table. It was a room designed for high-stakes decisions, a sterile theater where fortunes were made and careers were broken. Today, it was my stage. Miniature flags of the United States and the Navy stood on the table like tiny, silent soldiers, flanking a pitcher of iced water that was already beginning to sweat in the cool, climate-controlled air. Randall was in his element, a lion returned to his pride. He moved around the room with a proprietary air, shaking hands with each member of the Navy delegation. His handshake was firm, his eye contact unwavering. He greeted Admiral Hayes like an old comrade, launching into a well-worn anecdote about a tour of a naval armory in his youth. It was a performance of authenticity, a carefully crafted ritual designed to establish himself not as a contractor, but as one of them, a man who understood their world on a primal level. The Navy officers listened with polite, practiced stillness. I watched from my seat, a quiet observer, my hands resting calmly on the table. Noah sat beside me, stiff and silent, his gaze fixed on the blank projection screen at the front of the room. When the pleasantries were concluded, everyone took their seats. A low, expectant hush fell over the room. Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the board, gave a brief, formal welcome and then turned the floor over to Randall. Randall smiled, a broad, confident gesture. "Before we begin the simulation, my director of product development, Cassidy Vale, will initialize the system." He said my name with a dismissive, almost paternalistic air, as if I were a junior technician called upon to flick a switch. It was the only role he could conceive for me. I was the help. I rose from my chair without a word. I walked to the head of the table. The quiet click of my heels on the floor, the only sound in the room. At the console, I typed my username and password into the system. My fingers moved with calm. Practiced efficiency. The system accepted my credentials. I was the administrator. I held the keys to the kingdom. I initiated the presentation sequence, bringing the software to the login splash screen. The Halcyon Dynamics logo glowed on the massive 8K display, a silent promise of innovation and power. My job, as he had defined it, was done. "It's all yours, Randall," I said, my voice even. I stepped away from the console and returned to my seat, deliberately choosing one slightly away from the head of the table. I folded my hands in my lap. I had opened the door. Now it was time for him to walk through it. Randall sat down at the console, a king ascending his throne. The screen in front of him prompted for a username and a two-factor authentication code. His brow furrowed for a fraction of a second. This was a layer of security he hadn't anticipated. "System's asking for a code," he said, his voice laced with a faint trace of annoyance, directing the comment at me. "Yes," I replied simply. "It's a new security protocol. It should have sent a 6-digit code to your phone." He pulled his phone from his suit jacket, his movements a little too sharp. He squinted at the screen, then typed the numbers into the keyboard. On the main display, the system processed the request for a moment before the screen changed, granting him access. Login successful. He was in. What he didn't know was that the login was a concession, not a victory. His account, R. Pike, was not an administrator. I had granted it temporary, restricted access, the digital equivalent of a visitor's pass. He had just used his own phone, his own personal device, to create an unbreakable link between himself and this specific session. The first lock of the trap had clicked shut. With a confident flourish, he began. The first 3 minutes were a masterclass in corporate salesmanship. He spoke of vision, of heritage, of Halcyon's unwavering commitment to national security. His voice was a rich baritone, filling the room with practiced sincerity. On the screen, he navigated through the introductory slides filled with my team's data, my architectural diagrams, my work. He gestured towards the screen, taking credit with a casual wave of his hand. He even glanced up at the small, dome-shaped camera in the ceiling, the one Ben had installed, and smiled. He was performing for posterity, a man cementing his legacy in real time. He was utterly, beautifully, oblivious. Beneath the table, my phone vibrated once, a silent, haptic pulse against my leg. It was the signal from Ben. I didn't need to look. I knew what it meant. "We have a match." The timestamp from the camera feed, showing Randall logging in with his own credentials, was now synchronized with the server logs from the legacy folder. The digital chain of custody was complete, a perfect, unbroken line stretching from the moment of the theft to this exact second. The trap was now fully armed. It was time. I waited for him to finish a sentence. He paused for a sip of water, basking in the attentive silence of the room. I rose slowly to my feet. "Admiral, Captain Rostova," I began, my voice calm and professional, cutting cleanly through the quiet air. "If I may, I'd like to pause for just one moment. Before Mr. Pike proceeds with the simulation itself, I believe it would be beneficial to briefly clarify the permission architecture and the source attribution of the core system components." Every head in the room turned to me. I could feel Noah's stare like a physical weight. Randall's smile tightened, a barely perceptible crack in his polished facade. He was annoyed by the interruption, by the challenge to his seamless narrative. He saw my intervention not as a point of clarification, but as an act of insubordination. "That won't be necessary, Cassidy," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture meant to send me back to my seat like a chastened child. "I'll handle it. I have a firm grasp of the architecture." He turned his back to me, a deliberate, final dismissal, and faced the screen, to prove his command of the material, to reassert his authority in the room. He clicked the wireless presenter in his hand to advance to the next slide. It was the single most self-destructive act of his entire career. He expected to see the simulation's main control interface. He expected to continue his performance. But the slide that appeared was not in the presentation he had stolen. It was a blank, white slide, stark and empty, save for 2 lines of simple, black, 12-point text that materialized in the bottom left corner. The font was unassuming, the language neutral, but the words landed in the silent room with the force of a bomb. Source material origin: Project Rook, asset owner, Cassidy Vale. The 2 lines of text glowed on the screen, stark and absolute in the silent room. For a full 10 seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched hum of the projector's cooling fan. The air, once charged with corporate bonhomie, had become crystalline and brittle, the kind of stillness that precedes the shattering of glass. Every person in the room was a statue, their expressions frozen in various states of shock and confusion. Randall stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid, his hand still holding the wireless presenter like a dead weight. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to get brighter, harsher, bleaching all the color from the scene, leaving only the black text on the white screen. It was Captain Rostova who broke the spell. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a laser. She did not look at Randall. Her gaze was fixed on me. "Ms. Vale?" she asked, her tone level and inquisitive. "Who is Rook?" I met her eyes across the long, polished table. I took a deliberate breath, letting the question hang in the air for a moment longer. My voice, when I spoke, was calm and measured, the voice of a professor explaining a complex but logical theorem. Rook is the official designation for the firewalled product group I formed at the start of the Sovereign Initiative. I explained slowly. Its purpose was to ensure the project's technical integrity, to allow the core engineering to proceed independent of executive-level politics or marketing pressures. I paused. I am the director of that group. A choked, strangled sound came from the front of the room. It was Randall, trying to laugh. The noise was horrifying, a dry, rasping sound with no humor in it, the sound of a machine grinding its gears. He turned around, his face a ghastly mask of bonhomie. A sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. "A support group is what she means," he said, forcing a smile that was a rictus of exposed teeth. "A very talented support group, of course, but the strategic vision, the core concept, that was mine from the beginning. Rook was simply an internal code name for the implementation team." He was scrambling, trying to reframe the narrative, to shrink my role back into the small, subordinate box he had built for me, but the words on the screen behind him refused to be reframed. I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I picked up the small tablet computer lying on the table in front of me. With a few taps, I wirelessly took control of the presentation screen. Randall's pathetic, forced smile vanished as the blank white slide was replaced by a new image. It was a simplified flowchart, a clean, clear visual representation of a server log. 2 boxes were on the screen. One was labeled Source, Secure Server, Rook, Core, Files. The other was labeled Destination, Exec Server, RPike, Legacy. A single, thick red arrow connected them. Beside the arrow, in the same calm, system font, were the details. Action. Directory. Copy user account. A. Lo Goyi by executive delegation R. Pike. Timestamp 2247 October 2nd. The core files for this presentation were copied from the secure Rook server 2 weeks ago, I stated, my voice clinical, as if describing a natural phenomenon. They were copied by Mr. Pike's executive assistant, using his delegated authority, and placed in a private folder on his personal drive. A low murmur went through the room. Admiral Hayes leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed, studying the screen. Randall's face had gone from pale to ashen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I wasn't finished. At Halcyon, all formal project meetings are recorded for compliance and archival purposes, I said. Looking around the table, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the sleek black pen. I placed it on the table and tapped a small, almost invisible button on its side. A voice filled the room. Randall's voice, It was crystal clear, a high-fidelity recording of a conversation he had had with his assistant in his office. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders, a voice that never expected to be questioned. "Just make sure the final deck is clean," the recording of Randall said. "Scrub all the Rook watermarks, and take her name off it. The contract needs someone with credibility at the helm. It needs my name at the helm." The last words echoed in the dead quiet of the room. My name at the helm. I looked at Noah. He was staring at the pen on the table as if it were a venomous snake. He lifted his head slowly, and his eyes, wide with a horrified, dawning comprehension, met mine. His lips moved, forming a silent, broken word. My name, Cassidy, the foundation of his world, the carefully balanced construct of family loyalty and personal integrity, had just been pulverized. I stood up. I picked up the thick, cream-colored envelope from my briefcase. I walked the length of the table with measured steps and placed it gently on the polished wood in front of the chairman of the board, Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Chairman," I said respectfully, "this is a sealed document I prepared last night in consultation with our general counsel. I believe now would be the appropriate time to open it." Thorne, a man whose face was usually an unreadable slate, looked stunned. He stared at the envelope, then at Randall, then at me. With grim finality, he took the letter opener from his desk set and slit the envelope open. His large hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he pulled out the contents. He read the cover letter from Julian Croft. He scanned the notarized statement from the head of the compliance department, and then he examined the final page, which showed 2 long alphanumeric strings, 2 cryptographic hashes. The first was labeled by a hash, Rook Core Files. The second was labeled hash, Legacy Folder Contents. They were identical. The match was absolute. It was mathematical proof of the theft, as undeniable as gravity. Thorne placed the papers down on the table, aligning them into a neat, damning pile. He looked at Randall, and in his eyes, I saw 50 years of friendship and professional respect curdle into contempt. I had presented my case. The evidence was on the table. The mask was not just removed, it was shattered. I turned away from the corporate wreckage, from the family wreckage, and faced my clients. My voice was steady, my purpose clear. "Admiral Hayes, Captain Rostova," I said, my full attention now on them. "At Halcyon Dynamics, we respect process, and we honor authorship. The deception you have just witnessed is an internal matter that will be dealt with, but the work itself, the sovereign system, is real, and it is ready. I am its architect. Please," I concluded, "ask your questions." The accusation was the last, desperate act of a drowning man, cornered, exposed, and stripped of his dignity. Randall fell back on the only weapon he had left, the institutional fear of a security breach. He spun around, his face flushed with a sudden, righteous fury, and pointed a trembling finger not at me, but at the Navy delegation. "This is an outrage," he boomed, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "This is a deliberate and reckless security breach. Ms. Vale, in an act of blatant insubordination, has exposed proprietary system data in a live, unsecured environment. She has compromised the integrity of this entire project to push a personal agenda." He was trying to change the crime. He couldn't defend against the charge of theft, so he was inventing a new one, with me as the perpetrator. It was a classic misdirection, an attempt to bury the truth under a mountain of corporate protocol and fear. He was counting on their institutional caution, their ingrained aversion to risk. I didn't flinch. I let his words, heavy with false indignation, settle into the room. I gave the accusation space to breathe, and in that space, its own desperation became apparent. When I spoke, my voice was the antithesis of his. It was quiet, clinical, and utterly calm. "On the contrary, Admiral," I said, addressing Hayes directly, but ensuring everyone in the room could hear. "No sensitive data has been, or could be, exposed. The system is currently operating in a sandbox demonstration mode. The line of text you saw was not a data leak. It was an embedded diagnostic feature, designed specifically to verify the presenter's credentials against the project's registered author list in a secure offline environment. It's a failsafe to prevent misrepresentation. I paused, letting the key phrase land. As you can see, it is working perfectly. My explanation was precise, technical, and devoid of emotion. I had not only predicted his lie, I had built a feature to expose it, and then wrapped that feature in a perfectly defensible, legally sound security protocol. I had used the language of his world, process, security, verification, to dismantle his attack. Randall stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He had come to a gunfight armed with a press release, and he was just beginning to understand how outmatched he was. Admiral Hayes looked from me to Randall, his expression unreadable, but for the cold, hard set of his jaw. He was a man who had commanded warships, a man for whom competence and a clear chain of command were paramount. He had no time for this corporate soap opera. "We are not here to mediate a personnel dispute, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a low growl directed at the chairman. He then turned his gaze, which felt like a physical weight, back to the head of the table. "We are here to evaluate a defense system. I suggest we proceed with the person who actually understands its architecture. Ms. Vale, the floor is yours." It was a formal transfer of power, a field promotion in the middle of a battle. Randall seemed to shrink, the bluster draining out of him, leaving behind the shell of a man who had just been publicly rendered irrelevant. I gave a single, respectful nod to the Admiral. I picked up my tablet, and with a few swift keystrokes, took full administrative control of the simulation. "Of course, Admiral, let's move to the emergency recovery simulation." The screen flickered, and the bland corporate slides were replaced by a dynamic, complex interface, the Sovereign System's main command dashboard. A holographic, three-dimensional model of a naval battle group appeared at its center. I initiated a pre-scripted catastrophic failure scenario. Red alerts bloomed across the screen like digital wounds. "In this scenario," I began, my voice now that of the confident, expert architect, "the lead destroyer has sustained a direct hit to its primary sensor mast, resulting in a total loss of its forward-looking sensor data and a simultaneous network cascade failure across the entire battle group. The standard legacy response would be for the other ships to fall back to a defensive posture, a process which can take up to 30 critical seconds. Sovereign's logic is different." My fingers moved across the tablet, isolating data streams, highlighting the system's response in real time. Instead of simply reacting, Sovereign's autonomic recovery protocol immediately retasks a distributed network of secondary sensors from the surrounding frigates and cruisers. It doesn't just patch the hole, it reconstructs a complete, multi-layered sensory picture, using a predictive algorithm to fill in the missing data with a 99.8% accuracy rating. The system doesn't just recover, it adapts. On the main screen, the results were displayed in stark, beautiful numbers. A large gauge showed the system's response time to the simulated threat. The needle settled at 14.7 seconds. "As you can see," I said, "we have reduced the standard doctrinal response time by more than half." A young lieutenant commander seated next to Captain Rostova, an officer with the sharp, focused eyes of a career technologist, leaned forward, pointing a pen at a small data block on the screen. "Excuse me, Ms. Vale," he said, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "That optimization algorithm for the sensor data fusion, it's a variation of the Kantorovich-Hahn theorem, isn't it? Very few people use it in real-world applications because of its processing overhead." It was a moment of pure, unexpected validation from a peer. He recognized the esoteric, elegant heart of my design. "It is," I confirmed with a small smile. The overhead problem was the core of my postgraduate thesis. I studied under Professor Aris Thorne at the Institute. He developed a method for parallelizing the processing across a distributed network, which is what we've implemented here. I allowed myself a small, personal note. He was kind enough to send me a letter of recommendation for a senior fellow position just last night. A quiet, appreciative murmur went through the Navy contingent. I had not only answered the question, I had established my academic and professional pedigree in a way Randall, with all his folksy stories about harbors, never could. The final word, however, belonged to the chairman of the board. Marcus Thorne had been watching the entire exchange like a hawk, his face a grim, stony mask. The friend he had trusted had committed a mortal sin against the company. He needed to formalize the truth for the record. He raised his hand, and the room fell silent once more. "Ms. Vale," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. "For the purposes of the board, and for our partners in the Navy, I have one final question. Who is the sole registered author of the intellectual property package known as Sovereign Core?" This was the checkmate. I turned back to my tablet. With one final command, I brought up the last document. It wasn't a slide. It was a screenshot of Halcyon Dynamics' internal intellectual property registration portal. There, on the screen, was the official entry. Project name, Sovereign Core Lead Architect, designated, Rook. Digital signature hash, a long unbroken string of characters. Legal entity, binding, Rook, Sig, hash, Vale, Cassidy, EMP, ID 7743. "I am Mr. Chairman," I said simply. "The digital signature for the anonymous Rook Development Group is legally and cryptographically bound to my employee identification." The evidence was absolute. The truth was on the record. The coup was complete. I risked a glance at my husband. Noah was staring at the screen, his face pale. He looked at me, his wife, the architect, the woman who had just demonstrated an intellectual and strategic mastery he had never fully understood. Then, he turned his head and looked at his father, the fallen king, a man now exposed as a fraud and a liar, sitting silently at the head of the table he no longer commanded. And in the crushing, final silence of the room, Noah Pike said nothing at all. The silence in the room was a vacuum, pulling all the heat and sound into a single point of pressure. That point was Randall Pike. The complex layers of his persona, the charming patriarch, the visionary leader, the corporate statesman, had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, white-hot core of his ego. It was this core that finally erupted. "Betrayal!" The word was a guttural roar, torn from deep within his chest. He lunged forward, his hands slamming down on the mahogany table with a crack that made everyone flinch. His face was a mask of crimson fury, his eyes wild. He was no longer looking at the Navy or the chairman. He was looking only at me. "This is what it is. Betrayal of the deepest kind. In my own company, in my own family. To be torn down by my own son's wife, in front of men I have known for 30 years. His voice was thick with a sense of violation, the theatrical outrage of a king whose divine right had been challenged by a peasant. He was trying to frame himself as the victim, to cast my calculated presentation of fact as a vicious, personal attack. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I remained standing, my posture straight, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair. I let his tirade wash over the room, the sound of it loud and clumsy and desperate. When he finally paused, gasping for breath, I answered him. My voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "Betrayal," I said, defining the word with cold, clear precision, "is erasing the name of the person who did the work." The sentence, quiet as it was, had the force of a physical blow. It recentered the crime, placing it squarely back on him. It was not about family. It was about ethics. In the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Eleanor Pike, who had sat through the entire presentation as a silent, supportive statue, rose to her feet. Her face was ashen, her expression one of utter horror. She looked at her husband, then at me, and then at her son. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the conference room, her retreat a silent scream. Noah stood frozen in the space between his father's fury and my stillness. He was a human fault line, a man being torn in two. He looked helpless, his hands opening and closing at his sides, his face a canvas of anguish. He was the weak bridge, and he was collapsing. It was Admiral Hayes who restored order. He stood, his 6-foot frame radiating an aura of absolute command. "We will take a 10-minute recess," he announced, his voice a baritone that tolerated no argument. "Captain Rostova, with me." He gave a curt nod to Marcus Thorne and then, without a single glance at Randall, led his delegation out of the room, the door clicking shut behind them with a sound of damning finality. The moment the door closed, the room seemed to exhale. The raw, familial drama was now contained among its actors. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, wasted no time. He walked directly to me, his face grim. He spoke in a low, urgent voice that was meant for my ears alone. "Cassidy," he said, the formality of Ms. Vale gone. "You have the board's full support. This is unacceptable. Do you want to bring this before the disciplinary committee? You can demand his immediate and full termination. Whatever you want, you will have it." It was the offer of total victory, the power to utterly annihilate him. I could end his career, disgrace his name, and banish him from the company he had built. And I looked at Randall, who was now slumped in the chair at the head of the table, his rage spent, leaving him looking old and shockingly fragile. I thought of the years of quiet condescension, the endless Sunday dinners where I had to shrink myself, the theft of my work, and I realized what I truly wanted. "No," I said quietly to Thorne. "I don't want a hearing. I don't want his head. I want the project to continue. It's too important to get tied up in a corporate scandal." I looked the chairman in the eye. "I just don't want the wrong name on the cover." It was a statement of strategic mercy, and it was also the ultimate power move. My concern was for the work, not for vengeance. Thorne understood immediately. A look of profound respect and relief washed over his face. He nodded once, a gesture of solemn agreement. "I understand," he said. "Let me speak with—" But Randall had heard us. He pushed himself up from the chair, a new kind of energy in his movements. It was the desperate energy of a bargainer. He approached me, avoiding Thorne's gaze, his own eyes pleading. "Cassidy," he said, his voice now a hoarse whisper. "We can fix this. A co-author credit. No, a co-lead. We'll tell them it was a joint effort, a misunderstanding in the presentation. Pike and Vale. It sounds good, strong." It was pathetic, after everything. He still thought the credit was his to grant, a gift he could bestow upon me. He still didn't understand. He thought this was a negotiation. It was a surrender. I didn't answer him. I didn't even look at him. I reached into my leather portfolio, which I had left on my chair, and pulled out a single, glossy 8x10 photograph. It was an old press photo, slightly faded, from a charity gala. I placed it on the conference table, in the space between myself and Randall. The photo showed a younger Randall, beaming, his arms slung around the shoulders of another man, a former Halcyon executive named Richard Klein. Both men were holding champagne flutes, celebrating a victory. Randall stared at the photo, his face a mask of confusion. "What is this?" he stammered. I didn't speak. I simply pointed one finger to the date, printed in small white text in the bottom right corner of the photograph. June 12th, 2018. Then I looked up at Marcus Thorne, whose eyes had widened in recognition. "That photograph was taken the week Randall closed the deal with North Star Aerospace," I said, my voice as neutral as a news report. "The deal from the 2018 internal audit report, the one where he promised a feature we hadn't invented yet." I paused, then gestured to the other man in the photo. "And that is Richard Klein, his partner on that deal, whose employment was terminated by this board 6 months later for ethics violations and fraud." I had just drawn a straight, undeniable line from Randall's past malfeasance to a disgraced former partner. I had established a pattern. The theft of my project wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a career built on a foundation of quiet deceptions. The last of the color drained from Randall's face. The fight, the anger, the pleading, it all vanished, replaced by the hollow, slack-jawed look of absolute defeat. He looked down at the photograph, at the smiling ghost of his own past, and the wall of his reputation, the wall he had spent a lifetime building, finally came crashing down. The door to the Aurora conference room opened precisely 10 minutes later. The light from the hallway flooded in, stark and white. Framing Admiral Hayes in the doorway, he stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding the room. Followed by Captain Rostova and the rest of his delegation, they moved with the efficient, purposeful silence of people whose time was not to be wasted. The recess was over. The verdict was in. Admiral Hayes did not sit down. He stood at the end of the table, his hands clasped behind his back, and addressed Marcus Thorne, though his gaze swept over all of us. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "We require a definitive conclusion to this presentation. We need a clear statement on the final deployment roadmap and a formal confirmation of the team that will be responsible for seeing it through." There was no ambiguity in his request. He was cutting through the wreckage of the drama to the only thing that mattered: the work. He was demanding to know who was in command. Before Thorne could speak, I stepped forward. I had already cued the final slides on my tablet. The main screen behind me dissolved the damning image of the registration portal and replaced it with a clean, multi-phase timeline. "I can provide that, Admiral," I said, my voice clear and confident. For the next 5 minutes, I was no longer a daughter-in-law, no longer a victim of theft. I was the project director. I walked them through the 18-month deployment schedule, the 3-phase security protocol for the handover of the source code, and the dedicated support structure my team, the Rook team, now operating under its real name, would provide. My presentation was crisp, detailed, and utterly professional. It was a promise of stability, a demonstration that despite the chaos they had just witnessed, the project itself was solid, secure, and in competent hands. When I finished, a respectful silence held the room. I had answered their questions and reassured them of the project's viability. Now, only the formal confirmation remained. Marcus Thorne rose from his seat, his face grim but resolute. "Thank you, Cassidy," he said. He then turned to the Navy delegation. "In light of the information that has come to light today, and effective immediately, Halcyon Dynamics is making a formal change in the leadership of the Sovereign Project. Randall Pike will be stepping away from all duties related to this contract." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Ms. Cassidy Vale is hereby appointed the sole project lead. She and her team will have the full, unequivocal support of this board and this company. All communications regarding Sovereign will go through her office." It was a public execution. As Thorne spoke, a small, gray notification box appeared on the corner of the console screen where Randall still sat, slumped and defeated. "User R. Pike. Session terminated by administrator. System access revoked." He had been digitally erased. He was a ghost in the machine he had tried to claim as his own. He stared at the screen, at the final, impersonal dismissal. Then, he slowly lifted his head and looked at me. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, pleading disbelief. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. "Are you going to destroy me?" He still believed this was my doing, my act of destruction. He was incapable of seeing his own hand in his downfall. I looked back at him, not with triumph, not with hatred, but with a profound and weary clarity. "No," I said, my voice soft but firm. "You did that to yourself when you erased my name." While our final exchange hung in the air, a small, formal ceremony took place at the other end of the table. Captain Rostova placed a thin document folder in front of Admiral Hayes. He uncapped a pen and signed his name with a few sharp, decisive strokes. He pushed the folder toward me. It was the Memorandum of Understanding, the official acceptance of the simulation results, and the independent testing schedule. Business was concluded. The future was moving on. At that moment, a figure moved in my peripheral vision. It was Noah. He had been standing motionless, a statue of indecision. He took a slow breath, and it seemed to cost him everything. He looked at his father, a long, sorrowful look of farewell. Then he turned to me. His eyes were filled with a terrible shame. "I stayed silent," he whispered. The words meant only for me. "For too long. I just stayed silent." And with that quiet confession, he made his choice. He walked the few steps from his place and came to a stop directly behind my chair. He did not touch me, but his presence was a shield. It was a public declaration of allegiance, an act of loyalty that had come tragically late, but had come nonetheless. Randall saw it all. He saw the Navy signing documents with me. He saw his own son abandon him to stand behind my chair. He lifted his gaze from the wreckage on the table and looked toward the vast, sunlit window that made up the far wall of the room. He wasn't looking at the city skyline. He was looking at the reflection in the glass. He saw the scene as a photograph. The Navy officers standing, the chairman at the head of the table, and the new center of gravity, me, in my chair, with my husband standing guard behind me, and he saw himself, a solitary old man, seated off to the side, no longer in the center of the frame, no longer the focus of the picture. He was just a reflection in the glass, a fading image, already a part of the past. A sound, small but distinct, cut through the quiet hum of the room. Click. It was the electronic lock on the conference room door, its indicator light switching from green to red. The company's security system, acting on the chairman's remote command, had just deprovisioned his access card. His key to the kingdom, the one he had held for 50 years, was now just a useless piece of plastic. He was, in every sense of the word, out. With the formal business concluded, the charged atmosphere in the room began to dissipate, replaced by the low murmur of professional closure. I rose from my chair, my movements feeling deliberate and unhurried. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, crystalline calm. My first duty was to my client. I turned to the Navy delegation. "Admiral Hayes, Captain Rostova," I began, my voice steady and clear. "On behalf of Halcyon Dynamics, I want to thank you. You came here for a technical evaluation, and you were presented with a difficult internal matter. Your commitment to prioritizing truth and process is a standard we will strive to uphold. We look forward to our partnership." It was a formal acknowledgement of the day's unpleasantness and a promise of future integrity. Admiral Hayes gave me a curt, respectful nod. "The work speaks for itself. Ms. Vale," he said, "we expect to see you at the Norfolk base for the on-site integration next week." Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his hand extended to me. I shook it firmly. His grip was strong, a silent communication of support and relief. "I'll have my office schedule a kickoff meeting with you and he corrected himself. "Your team, for tomorrow morning, will get the new org chart and full authorization sorted out." He was already rebuilding, laying the new foundation with my name at its center. My business with the company and the client was done. Only the family remained. I turned, my gaze finally falling on Randall. He was still in his chair, a man hollowed out. The grand architecture of his life collapsed into a pile of rubble around him. He looked up at me, his eyes empty of everything but a vast, desolate bewilderment. He looked as if he was waiting for the final blow, the twist of the knife. He still expected this to be about personal vengeance. I would not give him that satisfaction. "You don't need to apologize to me," I told him, my voice devoid of malice or triumph. It was simply a statement of fact. "You need to apologize to the 6 engineers whose names you erased." I gave him the chance to be a leader, even in his disgrace, a chance to acknowledge the people whose work he had stolen. It was a final, simple test of his character. He opened his mouth. A faint, wheezing sound escaped. His jaw worked, but no words formed. He was searching for a script, a line, a way to spin this, but there was nothing left. The well of his self-serving words had finally run dry. He closed his mouth. The silence his final damning confession. He had failed. I turned from him then, to Noah. He was still standing behind my chair, a silent sentinel. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading hope, as if asking what came next for us. In the cold, clean light of what I had done, I knew I didn't have the answer. I slowly, deliberately, twisted the simple gold wedding band on my left hand. It slid off my finger with an unnerving ease. I took his hand. His skin was cold. I pressed the ring into the center of his palm and closed his fingers around it. The metal was still warm from my skin. "We'll talk," I whispered, my voice so low that only he could hear it. "After my meeting tomorrow." I was drawing a boundary. The work came first now. My work, my name. The life I had put on hold to accommodate the Pike family law of silence was over. He looked down at the ring in his hand, his expression crumbling. He understood. I let go of his hand and turned back to the table. Picking up my phone, I tapped the screen a few times, my fingers moving with practiced speed. I composed a short, precise email to the head of Human Resources and the Chief Financial Officer. Subject: Sovereign Project. Leadership Transition. Effective immediately. I will be assuming the role of project lead for Sovereign. Please update all relevant permissions and budget authorizations to reflect this change. The project team roster remains the same. A formal meeting will be scheduled for tomorrow at 0900 to discuss the revised project charter. I hit send. It was done. The authority was transferred. The record was corrected. The new era had begun. Not with a proclamation, but with an email. I gathered my portfolio and my briefcase. The meeting was over. My work here was finished. I walked toward the conference room door. As it slid open, the bright, clean light of the hallway poured in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt like standing on a shore, looking out at a vast, sunlit sea, a new day. I stepped out into the light. Behind me, I heard a sound. The heavy, pathetic scrape of Randall's chair being pushed back from the table. It was the sound of a king abdicating a throne he had already lost. I did not look back. In the hallway, my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. It was a new email, a calendar invitation from Admiral Hayes's office. Subject: On-site integration planning. Sovereign project location: Naval Station, Norfolk Primary. Attendee: Cassidy Vales. My name, not a title, not a role, my name. I stopped walking. I stood for a moment in the quiet, sun-drenched hallway. A slow smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of triumph or revenge. It was a smile of release, of beginning. I closed my phone. The screen went black. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more people, please support us by hitting that hype button. It makes a huge difference.